All right, everyone, let's get started. It's my great pleasure to welcome Asad Dandia virtually to the University of Michigan for a truly original intervention that brings together Muhammad Iqbal and Walter Benjamin. Asad is currently a community program coordinator with the Council on American-Islamic Relations, New York, a Sunday school teacher with the Islamic Learning Center of New York City, second faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, a graduate student in urban studies at the CUNY School for Labor and Urban Studies, and a freelance writer. His writing has been featured in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Al Jazeera English, among other venues. He additionally holds a master's in Islamic Studies from Columbia University. And in fact, the focus of his discussion today is taken from a chapter of his thesis that's entitled Rethinking Islamic Studies, Muhammad Iqbal's Philosophy as Decolonial Critique. Before I pass things over to Asad, just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function that's on the lower bar on your screen to type in questions throughout this talk, and when we enter the Q&A portion of the afternoon, we will respond to these questions together with Asad. Asad, without further ado.
Thank you so much, Adi, for this generous introduction, and thank you to Jillian as well for handling the logistics of the event, and thank you to the University of Michigan for hosting me online. I'm grateful to be here, and it's an incredible opportunity for me to share some of the findings of my research with you. This is actually my first time speaking on the topic in a university setting. Granted, we're on Zoom, but I'm really excited for this. This is a topic of my thesis and one that has been pressing on my mind for many, many years. Critical theory and religion. Just to give you all somewhat of a background on myself that was not featured in the bio. My background actually began as a community organizer. So I was organizing with the Muslim community here in New York City before I went into sort of the academic world at Columbia for my MA. And one of the deep frustrations that I had was that much of, I guess, the praxis of the organizing world that I was in and the theory of the academic world that I was in were not in conversation with each other. And around 2018 and 19, when I first started my program, I thought to myself, how can I find a way to integrate these things? So it was not what one might call a traditional academic goal or a traditional academic path. It was quite unorthodox, quite unheard of. But I embraced it. And so I spent a lot of my years in the university speaking with my professors, doing what I could to integrate theory with praxis and looking to draw from the tradition that I knew best, which was the Islamic tradition. So at this point, I had studied a number of languages within the Islamic tradition, Arabic, Urdu, Persian, so on. And I tried to see if I can integrate whatever I know from this tradition with contemporary critical theory and what I can draw from each one to sort of, in Marxian terms, create a synthesis. I also happened to learn Hebrew at the time, and I grew deeply fascinated with Jewish thought, both religious and secular Jewish thought. And I found in it very deep parallels to draw from in my own sort of quest, in my own sort of journey here in New York City. I discovered the work of Walter Benjamin and knew the work of Muhammad Iqbal as a Muslim philosopher. And I said, hey, look, these guys have a lot in common. There's a lot that can be done. And I did some research on what has been done, in terms of drawing those connections. I didn't find much. And so my hope was, for this, my thesis to draw a connection between them. And what I'm going to be presenting to you today is going to be one chapter of about 3 or 4 chapters in my MA thesis. And I'm going to read to you from my abstract as well as that particular chapter. Adi actually contacted me because I condensed and sort of summarized the chapter into a public-facing article, which I will now link to you in the chat, which we published for the LA Review of Books. This was published shortly after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And I thought it was quite relevant for all of us as we think about new ways to imagine what a different world can look like and how we can draw from our pre-existing traditions and creatively reinterpret them to make that world possible. So that's like a quick background on myself and sort of the drive to do this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read from my abstract, as well as some passages from the chapter. After that, we'll move to Q&A discussion, and I'd love to hear from audience and participants as to their thoughts. Just one quick comment. My internet has been a little laggy this morning, so if any point I'm lagging or you can't hear me properly, Adi or Jillian, just please send me a ping so I know to readjust. Okay, so that being said, my thesis was titled Rethinking Islamic Studies, Muhammad Iqbal's Philosophy as Decolonial Critique. Muhammad Iqbal, I will give a brief introduction to who he was and why, for example, I cited his work, and what brings him into conversation with Walter Benjamin. First, let me read from my abstract. The challenge of decolonizing knowledge in the academy is one that is contemplated by all those working to undo the epistemic violence inaugurated by colonial modernity and sustained by its post-colonial transmutations. The process itself raises questions about resources, methodologies, and conclusions. What does it mean to undertake a decolonial approach in one's research? How can one submit a decolonial gesture without falling into either the trap of intellectual nativism on one side or reinscribing the colonial on the other? What does decoloniality look like both in terms of methodology as well as epistemology, and how can it help us in advancing new forms of knowledge? These questions are particularly resonant in Islamic studies. Islam, perhaps unlike any other intellectual tradition among the Enlightenment's supposed others, looms large over the Western imagination, both as a foreign object of exoticism as well as a specter of barbarism. Caught between various binary concepts such as religious, secular, traditional, modern, so on and so forth, as the archetype of one or as the foil of another, the study of Islam in the Western Academy, with some notable exceptions, has yet to fully shake off its colonial vestiges. This thesis is a meditation by a student of Islamic studies over what it means to think more capaciously about decoloniality as it concerns modern Islamic thought. Toward this endeavor, this thesis will aim to make a decolonial intervention in the field through an investigation of concepts drawn from the work of a modern Muslim thinker, Muhammad Iqbal, born 1877, died 1938. This era is important because this is the late 19th, early 20th century. Died sort of right at the cusp of World War II, but had seen enough of conflict in Europe to sort of come to many of his ideas. I argue that the philosophy of Iqbal functions both as an internal critique of the Islamic tradition and as a subversive site for thinking about the decolonial in the academy by defying the easy categorizations that have arrested our intellectual imaginations. So rather than framing Iqbal as a Muslim modernist or as the intellectual forefather of Pakistan, as the literature has mostly done, I look to his thought independently of these posthumous labels, showing how engagement with the Islamic traditions on its own terms can offer new analytical tools for understanding modern Muslim subjectivity, and how this subjectivity can bring to the fore epistemologies that have hitherto been unexplored. And so here's a quick summary of what the actual thesis looked like. The introduction sets the terms of the discussion with a critical literature review that traces and interrogates prevailing methodologies and their epistemological assumptions as they concern Islam as an object of analysis. And then I have 3 chapters. Chapter 1 explores Iqbal's construction of selfhood, arguing that it challenges selfhood as constructed both within the Islamic tradition and as constructed by the Enlightenment. Chapter 2 looks at consciousness, demonstrating that consciousness for Iqbal was neither restricted to theological conditions nor material conditions, but incorporated and defied both. Chapter 3, which is the focus of our talk today, looks at time and agency, arguing that Iqbal's conception of time was neither linear nor cyclical, but what I like to say as regenerative. And the aim of each chapter is to demonstrate that Iqbal, as a decolonial thinker, was able to critique the terms set by colonial modernity without resorting to an intellectual nativism, nor by reinscribing the colonial. By bringing Iqbal into conversation with thinkers both classical and contemporary, I show how scholars can engage creatively and critically with the Islamic traditions in ways hitherto unexplored, opening up new horizons for understanding Islamic thought and its place in the world. If you were to ask me to give you an elevator pitch of everything I just said, I would say that I'm hoping and aiming to canonize Muhammad Iqbal within sort of the panoply of thinkers that we often turn to when we think about critique. And one of the gaps that I found in the literature was that religion, and particularly religious studies, there's almost an implicit assumption in the field that religion is incapable of critique, that critique is only possible outside of religion. Religion can only be an object of analysis. It can never be something that analyzes. For me, I wanted to sort of disrupt that idea, that mentality, and to say, actually, look, here we have someone who was neither a nativist, nor was he reinscribing sort of post-Enlightenment ideas. He cannot be boxed into either or. And so in chapter 3, I bring him into conversation with Walter Benjamin, whom I found to be a very, I guess, kindred spirit of Iqbal. And I brought them into conversation with one another. So a very brief bio of who Iqbal was for those who may not know. So Muhammad Iqbal was born in 1877 in the town of Sialkot, which is a small town in the Punjab province. It's now part of modern-day Pakistan. He studied intensively in British India under prominent teachers such as Shibli Nomani and Sayyid Mir Hassan, through whom he learned Arabic and Persian, as well as the Islamic sciences. This multilingual education was common for those who were able to undertake high standard traditional education in the subcontinent. Iqbal was arguably the last of a generation of South Asian intellectuals who were deeply rooted in India's Persianate heritage, as well as, some may argue, one of the last Persianate Muslim philosophers. And when I say Persianate, I am inclusive of the countries of Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, and generally anywhere where the Persian language was spoken or written. He studied in Cambridge and Munich, where he earned his bachelor's and doctorate respectively, while qualifying as a barrister at Lincoln's Inn. And because of this wide exposure to various registers of knowledge, he was primed to be a formidable thinker from an incredibly young age. For the purposes of this paper, he is useful as a focal point of analysis because of the unique historical juncture he occupied, which placed him neither squarely within the old Islamic episteme nor comfortably in the new one. He was kind of in what we academics like to call a liminal space, neither here nor there. He was a microcosm of a world in transition. He saw it as his duty to carry the tradition he inherited and bring it into fresh relevance for the world that he was entering. Though he did this through prose and poetry, it is the latter which he deployed to transform literary aspects of traditional Islamic motifs into drivers of history, bringing them into the consciousness of the Muslim believer. So he was both a poet as well as a philosopher. Okay, so now let's move to a chapter of focus for our discussion today. Okay. So the chapter is called Time, and it is a reflection and a meditation on the parallels between Muhammad Iqbal and Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin, as we know, is a German Jewish thinker, had tragically committed suicide, fleeing the Nazis. He was known as he was the first of many thinkers in the school that we have come to know now as the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. He had spent all of his time in Europe, and he had actually overlapped with Iqbal in Europe. So Iqbal, though he was raised in the subcontinent, he had what might call a cosmopolitan education, educated both in England and Germany, and was in many ways a Germanist. Iqbal was also a Bergsonian, which we'll come to see as I read through this chapter, very deeply influenced by Henry Bergson. But as it concerns the focus of our discussion today. His critique of the tradition, of the Islamic tradition in particular, and his advancement at the same time of the Islamic tradition as a critique of modernity is what struck to me. So without further ado, let me start with the chapter. It is not an exaggeration to say that the historical relationship between Marxism and theology has often been marked by mutual apprehension or outright antagonism. On the one hand, orthodox Marxism posits a vulgar materialism where theology exists as a superstructure and functions as little more than a mystification of the real, capital R. On the other hand, orthodox theologies, particularly those of Christianity and Islam, have often viewed Marxism with suspicion on account of its atheist origins. With few exceptions, this has left little room for intellectual dialogue, let alone cross-pollination between discursive and embodied traditions in navigating the structures of capitalist modernity. However, recent developments in the academy, like the turn towards metaphysics and continental philosophy, the provincialization of hitherto universalized secular categories, and the unsettling of teleological historicism have all created new opportunities for fresh and nuanced engagements with various and otherwise ostensibly contradictory conceptual paradigms. This chapter aims to bring Iqbal into conversation with the stream of Marxism known as critical theory, represented by Walter Benjamin. I bring in Iqbal's conception of time and his critique of Sunni Ash'arite conceptions of time into dialectic with Benjamin's conception of history and his critique of orthodox Marxist conceptions of history. And I argue that the two of them, when read together, offer more capacious avenues for bringing religious thought into a constructive mode of engagement with historical materialism in the pursuit of a better world. Walter Benjamin, who was born in 1892 and died in 1940, lived roughly around the same time as Iqbal, but never met him. My purpose in drawing this parallel is also to demonstrate that Iqbal's articulation of time resembled that of Benjamin, and yet little is discussed about Iqbal in the academy on this front. I draw from Walter Benjamin's Thesis on the Philosophy of History, which shares overlaps with Iqbal's writing. Both were grounded in their respective religious traditions, and yet at the same time, they interpreted them in such a way as to defy the binary categories, secular or religious, that our present intellectual imaginaries impose upon them. While we've long taken for granted our conceptions of time and history as linear and predetermined, thanks largely to the homogenizing effects of the nation state and of capitalism, our two interlocutors offer an opportunity to think about what Talal Asad has referred to as heterogeneous time, conceptions of time that animated various religious traditions and that, quote, continuously dislocate the present from the past, the world experience from the world anticipated, and call for the revision and reconnection, end quote. So perhaps in recovering heterogeneous time, we can undo the rational, linear, and calculative conceptions of time and history that have been imposed upon us by the modern secular nation state and by capitalism. Iqbal has a book called The Reconstruction of Religious Thoughts in Islam, and he grapples with the concept of time in his third lecture in that book. So the book is actually a collection of lectures that he delivered all across India near the end of his life, and they are sort of in many ways his magnum opus. And so in his third lecture, in The Reconstruction, he critiques what he calls the doctrine of atomic time, which he associates with the mainstream Ash'arite school of Sunni Muslim theology. Iqbal says, quote, time, according to the Ash'arite, is a succession of individual nows. From this view, it obviously follows that between every two individual nows or moments of time, there is an unoccupied moment of time, that is to say, a void of time, end quote, which Iqbal deems to be an absurdity. He criticizes the Ash'arite theologians for making sense of time through what he calls a purely objective, i.e. a rational point of view, thereby failing to perceive the subjective aspect of time. And in order to disabuse of both the Ash'arite conception, which Iqbal says is affirmed by modern science today, one must think of time not as atomic, but as organic, as a site of dialectical relationships between the ultimate ego. And when Iqbal says ultimate ego, he really means God. So he views time as an organic site of dialectical relationships between the ultimate ego, who realizes and measures, so to speak, the infinite wealth of his own undetermined creative possibilities, and the ego, lowercase e, i.e. the human being, whose constitution represents but one of those many possibilities. The ego, therefore, lives in eternity while at the same time living in time. And thus, for the Iqbalian self, or the Iqbalian conception of the self, time is neither spatialized nor linear, nor is it even cyclical. It's regenerative. It neither romanticizes the past nor merely ponders over the future. Instead, it carries the past with it as it actively creates the future. This creative process is crucial in the Iqbalian calculus. It allows room for a conception of time, of creative work, and human agency that does not rely on Western epistemologies, but is anchored in a Quranic cosmology of self-mastery. As Iqbal writes, in this book, he calls Badal in the Light of Bergson. So for context, Badal was an Indian Persian poet. And Iqbal interprets Badal, this Indian Persian poet, in light of Henry Bergson. And Iqbal says, quote, "This message discloses to us that the element of time, which physical science ignores in its study of external things, constitutes the very essence of living things, and is only another name for life. Thus," in fact, let me see if I can share my screen here, so you don't just see. Okay. This method discloses to us that the element of time, which physical science ignores in its external study of things, constitutes the very essence of living things, and is only another name for life. Thus, the ultimate reality is time, the stuff out of which all things are made. A becoming, movement, life, and duration are only synonymous expressions. But this time, which Bergson calls pure duration, must be carefully distinguished from the false notion with which our mathematical intellect forms of it. Our intellect regards time as an infinite straight line, a portion of which we have traversed and a portion has yet to be traversed. This is only in rendering time to a space of one dimension with moments as its constitutive points. This spatialized time is false, unreal time. Real time, or pure duration, does not admit of any statically conceived todays and yesterdays. It is an actual ever-present now, which does not leave the past behind it, but carries it along in its bosom and creates the future out of itself. Thus, reality, as conceived by Bergson, is a continuous forward creative movement with opposites implicit in its nature and becoming more and more explicit as it evolves itself. It is not a completed whole of which we can possess a complete system of truth. Now, what does all of that mean? Now I'm going to expand on a concrete case. So in order to make a case of all of this philosophizing that you just heard, Iqbal actually undertakes a comparative analysis between the Quranic and the biblical narrative of the fall of man. This legend of the fall of man, which we're all familiar with, right, has distinct valences within the Quranic narrative that distinguish it from the biblical narrative, according to Iqbal's reading. In this legend, man enters a temporal world, a world in which time and history have a beginning. Iqbal interprets the Quran to suggest that this story challenges linear conceptions of time by narrating the history of the past, present, and future as though they are occurring in a single moment. The Quran, for those who may not know, does not aim to give its stories a wealth of historical detail, but rather aims at giving them a universal moral or philosophical import. It is not the names and numbers that are of prime significance, but their moral exhortations. The Quran asks its listeners to remember or to recall the stories of prophets, suggesting to these listeners that they had a share in the events, a move that functions both as an affective and a moral device. So for those who may not know, the Quranic telling of many of the biblical narratives is told to the listener. You know, if you open up even a translation, the story is told to you as if you already knew the story. And it's inviting you to recall it or to remember it or to tap into that chamber in your mind and to reactivate what you already know. And so Quranic history in many ways is a meta history which is enacted in bursts where the ego is brought into dialectic with the ultimate ego. And it is in this sense where Iqbal says the ego is both living in eternity, in that the ego is in dialectic with the divine, and living in what he calls serial time, which is the ordered time of our temporal world. So in the Quranic telling of the fall of man, or Adam is banished from paradise for eating the forbidden fruit, though it is not from the Quranic paradise, which is described as the eternal abode of the righteous that man fell from, but from a different place. So in the Quranic telling of the fall of man or the fall of humankind, but both Adam and Eve are condemned for the act. But it is not the Quranic paradise, right? The eternal abode where the righteous are promised to live in abundancy forever, but is a different place. And in this place, Iqbal writes, the very first event that took place was man's sin of disobedience, followed by his expulsion. Iqbal writes that man's station prior to the fall symbolizes what he says, quote, the conception of a primitive state in which man is practically unrelated to his environment and consequently does not feel the sting of human wants, the birth of which alone marks the beginning of human culture, right? So you can see him speaking in very Hegelian and Marxian terms, right? Primitive state, right? Where man is practically unrelated to his environment. This is before the division of social classes come in, right? And this is before the division, and in Iqbal's case, in the story of the fall of man, this is before the division of free will and destiny comes in. And so here is where the fall of man, which is in the biblical narrative framed as the quintessential crisis, is inverted as a rise. If man fell, he only fell in a temporal sense, but in terms of individuating, man emerged towards a higher state of consciousness, expressed with what Iqbal says, the possession of a free self, capable of doubt and disobedience. It is precisely in possessing the capacity to disobey, and this is key, it is precisely in possessing the capacity to disobey, to refuse, and to rebel, qualities which damned the humankind in paradise, that humankind arises to a higher state, elevating humanity on earth. Iqbal writes that man's first act of disobedience was also his first act of free choice. And that is why, according to the Quranic narration, Adam's first transgression was forgiven, end quote. So the Quranic narrative of the fall of man eventually ends with Adam seeking the forgiveness of God and being forgiven for God for exercising his free choice. So Iqbal writes, based on this, goodness is not a matter of compulsion. It is the self's free surrender to the moral ideal and arises out of a willing cooperation of free egos. So the quintessential crisis of the biblical narrative becomes a site of ultimate freedom in the Quranic version. In this rereading of the fall of man, not only does Iqbal maintain fidelity to the Quranic telling, but he infuses it with the urgency towards creative and free action that must at every moment renew itself rather than take a predetermined path. Iqbal says, a being whose movements are wholly determined like a machine cannot produce goodness. It is only in having the freedom to fail that the freedom to succeed carries meaning. It is only in tragedy where triumph becomes possible. And it involves not just humankind, but God, who are in an organic relationship with each other. Quote, that God has taken this risk shows his immense faith in man. It is for man now to justify this faith, end quote. So how is this relevant to Walter Benjamin's ideas? How does it connect to Walter Benjamin? And so a kindred spirit is actually found in Walter Benjamin. Though Iqbal and Benjamin lived around the same period, there's nothing to indicate that they met or read each other's works, which again, to me, is quite fascinating. We have nothing to show that they read each other's works or that they were even familiar with each other's existence. Yet in many ways, they faced some very similar trials. One finds surprising overlaps in their philosophical overall, given that crises shaped both of their intellectual trajectories. For Iqbal, that crisis was British colonialism. He lived under the British Raj. Iqbal actually never saw Indian independence. And for Benjamin, it was the advance of Nazism. Now, while the concepts they deployed were thoroughly rooted within their respective traditions, they were at the same time worldly and thus defied the secular and religious binaries that entrap our contemporary epistemological frameworks. Like Iqbal, Benjamin was troubled with the conception of time that assumed a predetermined and linear history. But whereas Iqbal, who was thoroughly rooted in the German tradition, but also a committed Muslim, found himself critiquing the stagnancy of religious thought, Walter Benjamin, by contrast, who was also rooted in German tradition, took aim at what he saw as the vulgar historicism that had overtaken Marxist thought. In his ninth thesis, Benjamin points, again, this is Benjamin's theses of the philosophy of history. In his ninth thesis, Benjamin points to Paul Klee's painting of an angel as a representation of what he calls the angel of history. I'm sure the Jewish studies scholars attending this are very familiar with this one. It's his most famous and most cited thesis. This angel, that represents the angel of history, while facing forward, is pushing backwards by a storm so strong that all it can do is watch the accumulation of debris in front of it. And Benjamin writes, that which we call progress is this storm. And the accumulating debris represents all of the crises of the past. And the task of the historical materialist is to consciously take up these pieces and redeem the past in the present. Benjamin contrasts the historical materialist to the historicist, because for the historicist, the past is a bygone period in the march towards progress. So Benjamin's intervention here is in redeeming historical materialism from historicism. And Iqbal does something similar in his discussion on divine knowledge and time. Knowledge, like progress, according to Iqbal, is not static, but rather denotes a kind of accumulation and evolution. Just like Benjamin's angel of history, who sees the full sweep of time in one instant, Iqbal ponders over a conception of divine knowledge, which, quote, makes God immediately aware of the entire sweep of history, regarded as an order of specific events in an eternal now. Iqbal goes further to suggest, while this may be an appealing conception of God, insofar as it preserves God's foreknowledge of all events, it forecloses God's freedom, right? So conception of God where divine knowledge is sort of in front, the entire sweep of history, and framed as what Iqbal calls an eternal now. It's an appealing conception of God because it preserves God's knowledge of all events, but at the same time, it forecloses God's own freedom. Iqbal writes that the future certainly pre-exists in the organic whole of God's creative life, but it pre-exists as an open possibility, not as a fixed order of events with determined outlines, end quote. In a similar gesture arguing for the radical contingency of history, Benjamin asserts that history is not merely an archive to be measured in dates or uncovered through historical work, but something to be made again and again and again. Benjamin writes that history is the object of a construction whose place is formed not in homogeneous and empty time, but in that which is fulfilled by the here and now, which in German is pronounced Jetztzeit, which he writes in Thesis 14. The historicist assumes, as Benjamin cites in Thesis 5, that the truth will not run away from us. There's an assumption that the truth is always there, right? So the vulgar historicist might say, well, the truth is already there, it just needs to be uncovered, it needs to be demystified. The Orthodox religious believer might say, well, the truth is always there, it just needs to be, again, unveiled for us, right? And this is an overlap between sort of vulgar Orthodox theology and vulgar historicism. The historical materialist, by contrast, as Benjamin writes in Thesis 6, views her duty towards history as one where she must, quote, take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. Similarly, for Iqbal, history cannot be conceived of as, quote, merely as a gradually revealed photo of predetermined order of events, because in that case, quote, there's no room for it. There's no room in it for novelty and initiation. And if we conceive of history in this way, then we can attach no meaning to the word creation, which has a meaning for us only in view of our own capacity for original action. So the Orthodox Sunni Muslim is to Iqbal what the historicist is to Benjamin. Benjamin also draws deeply on the Jewish spiritual practice of remembrance. This spiritual practice anchors him in a praxis that views the longue durée of history as one in which the past is inextricably connected to the present. As Benjamin writes in Addendum B in his 18th thesis, it was the Jewish prohibition on predicting the future and the active remembrance of the past which kept the Jews from indulging in empty and homogeneous time. And I'll just quickly quote it. He says, quote, "It is well known that the Jews were forbidden to look into the future. The Torah and the prayers instructed them, by contrast, in remembrance," end quote. Through Jewish liturgy's emphasis on remembering the past, while grounding oneself in the present, there is in every moment an opportunity for redemption and freedom. The prohibition on speculating over the future may have disenchanted some, Benjamin writes, but, quote, "the future did not, however, turn into a homogeneous and empty time for the Jews, for in it, every second was the narrow gate through which the Messiah could enter," end quote. The crisis of time is not to be overcome by merely anticipating a presumed redemptive future, but by consciously working to redeem all moments of time in the present. As Benjamin writes in his 16th thesis, it is precisely a concept of a present which is not a transition, in whose time originates and has come to a standstill, that precisely defines the present in which he writes history for his person. So for both Muhammad Iqbal and Walter Benjamin, the prospect of creativity exists precisely because what stands before us cannot be known. It must be consciously made. And it is precisely in crisis, whether that crisis is the fall of man or the storm of progress, where new possibilities for emancipation arise. Time is as much a part of creative work as is history, both of which demand an urgent attention to the present without taking for granted what the future ought to be. So while Benjamin critiques the orthodox Marxists' predetermined conception of history, Iqbal critiques the orthodox Muslims' predetermined conception of time. Both of them saw their critique as taking their respective traditions to their own emancipatory conclusions. To quote Iqbal, "I believe there is a divine tendency in the universe, but this tendency will eventually find its complete expression in a higher man, not in a God subject to time," end quote. To read Benjamin and Iqbal in conversation with each other is to then recover the quality of history and time as sites through which radical praxis can materialize. In Iqbal's Islam and in Benjamin's Judaism, time is neither linear nor cyclical, but regenerative. It is precisely its regenerative quality which allows us to conceive of possibilities for a world anew, driven neither by the arrogance of a preconceived linearity, nor limited by the closure of a perpetual cyclicality. And that brings me to the end of my chapter. And I think I'll end there. I've been going on for a long time. And I thank you all for listening, and I'll open up now the stage to a conversation with the audience.
Thank you very much, Asad. If you have questions at this stage, you can start using the Q&A function, typing your questions out, and then we will work through them. To get us started, Asad, I think the way you started and the way you ended your talk fits very nicely, I think, together when you were talking about yourself and your trajectory, and how a lot of the work that you do embodies this conversation or this relationship between praxis and theory, something that can be often separated in the academic world, very unfortunately. And I was very taken by the concept of regenerative time, and I wanted to ask you, so right at the end, you said to read Benjamin and Iqbal in conversation is to recover time in history as sites through which radical praxis can materialize. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to what radical praxis looks like, and how, as an organizer and as a scholar, you have been personally influenced by the concept of regenerative time in the work that you do.
Great question. Thank you, Adi, for engaging. For me, again, as I mentioned, a lot of the impetus for this was drawn out of a deep frustration. Again, both with for lack of more sophisticated term, orthodox, my own tradition, as well as Marxism, right? Orthodox Marxism, and I didn't find myself fitting squarely into either camp. Bringing myself into this, right, as a committed believer, but also as a committed organizer. The questions I asked were, well, what are the ways in which we can go beyond simplifying these two categories and think much deeper about how these traditions have something deeper to offer us, and that no one of us is sitting here sort of untethered from tradition, right? Or as my mentor Talal Asad likes to call discursive tradition. All of us are part of discursive traditions, whether we like it or not, but it's about how we want to embody and practice those traditions. And for me, that was bringing them into conversation with contemporary crises and contemporary issues of the day, right? Particularly in response to everything that happened in 2020 with the pandemic, and almost trying to break out of the epistemic closures that we find ourselves in. And so for me, thinking through how the world as a possibility rather than as something that's given has been very crucial for me. And so I found in Iqbal's rereading of the Islamic tradition as something that inaugurates agency or allows human beings to reclaim their agency, to me was very empowering, and to me it was very rich. And I thought to bring it into conversation with a contemporary Jewish thinker who also lives sort of within that paradigm. And it, given the resurgence of interest in critical theory, both in the academy but also in the public sphere, with the culture wars, I tried trying to separate the wheat from the chaff and focusing on, what these things can really offer us, were central for me and for my exploration. I see two questions in the Q&A. Should I read them out loud before engaging them, or?
Yeah, Asad, if you could read it out, just so that if people
Sure.
want the recording, they'll know what the question was.
Okay, so question from Nadav Lineal. Please forgive me if I've mispronounced the name. Thank you for such an exciting and thought-provoking talk and for bringing these two thinkers together. Two questions, bringing into conversations two Judeo-Christian theological/temporal conceptions. One, is there a way in which this works with against the Jewish notion that everything is known, i.e. predetermined, already seen, and /but with one's agency? Great question. I would say it works with this notion. I'm no expert. I just want to, put it out there. My strength is in Islamic studies and not Jewish studies. Before publishing this, I had to seek the help of many Jewish studies scholars and Jewish philosophers, and I'm very appreciative of that. But if I were to take a crack at it, I would say that it works with the notion that everything is known, but also that one's agency is given. And within these, I would say that within the Islamic conception or the Islamic attempt to reconcile free agency and predetermination, the Asharite school has sort of been the dominant paradigm, where actions are known or predetermined by God, but they are, as the Asharite might say it, acquired. The Arabic conception is kasb, which is to say that all good deeds are acquired by you in the moment in which you are performing them. And this is done in a way to, I don't want to use the word absolve, but the question of, well, if all things are known by God and all things are willed by God, is evil also willed by God? And the way that the Asharite goes around this is by saying that everything is willed by God, but actions are acquired by the agent or the human being. And this is a way of saying that whether good or evil acts you perform, you are acquiring them. And I would say for Benjamin, the idea is that you are working with what's already known and seen, but you are working as a human agent at the same time. You're drawing from what God has, you're drawing from the tools that have been given to you, right? Whether it's in the Torah or predetermined by, a divine force, but you are acting with full agency in the world of possibilities, right? And so thinking about the categories of what's possible rather than categories of staticness has helped me sort of think through some of these questions. How does this work with the Christian notion of prefiguration? This, I must be honest with you, I'm not able to answer because I didn't focus too deeply with the Christian notion of this question. I focused primarily on the Islamic and Jewish question, so I don't want to give an answer that's not qualified. So I'll have to defer to that one. Thank you for asking. The second question says, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Please, how the Sufism had impact on vision of Iqbal about the world and the other. I'm not sure I understand the question. Please, how the Sufism had impact on vision of the. Oh, okay, I understand the question. I think the question is asking, how did Sufism have an impact on Iqbal's vision of the world and the other? Sufism has had a significant. I'm glad you asked that question. That was the first chapter of this thesis, which I was unfortunately unable to go through just because of the subject matter and length. Iqbal's critique of Sufism was actually profound, and he was in many ways targeted for his sharp criticism of Sufism. So his main critique of Sufism, he has a quote. In fact, let me see if I can find it because I think this is really, really, really important. Give me 2 seconds. Okay, here it is. So I write about this in my second chapter on consciousness. Iqbal opens up his 5th chapter of Reconstruction with the following quote by a prominent Sufi mystic. The Sufi mystic is Abdul Quddus, and Abdul Quddus writes, Muhammad of Arabia ascended the highest heaven and returned. I swear by God that if I had reached that point, I should never have returned, end quote. Iqbal takes this quote and he goes on to say that in all of the Islamic tradition, it's very difficult to find words which in a single sentence disclose such an acute perception of the difference between the prophetic consciousness and mystic consciousness or Sufi consciousness. While the mystic goes to meet God in a unitary experience with the divine, the prophet returns into the earthly realm to insert himself into the sweep of time with a view to control the forces of history and thereby to create a fresh world of ideals. So put aside Iqbal's use of the term mystic, which is sort of antiquated. Iqbal here is saying that the Sufi seeks a unitary mode of existence with God, or the mystic, if you want to use that term, right? The ascetic, right? The monk, and seeks to remain in that state. Whereas the prophet enters into that state, but then comes back into the world, right? The world of history, the world where human agents operate. And he says this is a major distinction between the Sufi and the prophet, right? And he says that believers, Muslim believers, but you can perhaps extend it to other traditions, have become too enraptured by the Sufi conception of consciousness, where you're seeking to enter sort of into a unitary state with God, but and staying there, right? In more practical terms, going to the mosque and praying, but never actually operating in the world. And he says, well, you know, the prophetic conception of consciousness is very different. The Islamic story tells the story of the ascension, where the prophet travels overnight from Mecca to Jerusalem and ascends into the highest heavens. And after ascending to the heavens, where he comes into dialogue with God, comes back down to the earth, right, to the temporal world, to the world of history, and moves, you know, human agents, or moves as a human agent, operates as a human agent. And he says this is what distinguishes prophetic consciousness from Sufi consciousness. So Iqbal here is critiquing Sufism. He's saying that it's you know, Sufism entails engaging with the world, right? But there's something in Iqbal's critique of Sufism that makes him differ from what one might call a Muslim modernist or a secularist, right? In articulating what he calls for a prophetic consciousness, he distinguishes between the source of revelation, which places the prophet in the ancient world, and the spirit of revelation, which places him in the modern world, right? The ancient and modern trope for Iqbal is a synecdoche for inner and outer knowledge. Iqbal says that prophecy has abolished itself, right? Because Muslims believe that Muhammad was the final prophet, and that prophecy abolished itself after Muhammad. And with the abolition of prophecy, mystic consciousness has come to an end. But with the abolition of prophecy, it does not mean that consciousness has come to an end. Rather, it means that this consciousness is unearthed through worldly means. And so to answer the question, Iqbal he would call himself a Sufi, but he was also very critical of Sufism. And if you read his poetry, there are certain Sufi poets whom he criticizes for sort of advancing a very static conception of theology, of history, and of time, and other Sufi poets whom he supports and sort of advances. Hafiz, for example, Hafiz was a Persian Sufi poet in Iran. Iqbal is actually very critical of him, and many people get, if you speak to someone who is familiar with Hafiz's Sufi poetry, people get offended at that. And Iqbal's sort of conception of Sufism is that Hafiz's use of Sufi motifs are very static, right? They sort of dwell in the world of high mysticism. Whereas by contrast, Rumi, right, the medieval Sufi poet born in Afghanistan, is someone whose poetry rather motivates you towards action, right? Allows you to reclaim your agency and so on. So the way I try to, present my thesis is to say that Iqbal critiques the Sufi tradition and the Islamic tradition from within the tradition. And he does it in such a way without sort of, falling into the binary of secularist versus traditionalist. He's in neither of those camps, right? He's a committed believer, he's a committed Muslim, and he's critiquing his tradition from within the tradition and drawing very, very consciously from, German Romanticism and other sort of ideas that influence it. Susanna Heschel. Oh my God, Susanna Heschel is listening to this talk. Oh my God. Wow. I'm so humbled. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I look forward to reading your dissertation as a book soon. My question is whether you see an influence of Freud on Iqbal and Benjamin. I'm thinking specifically about the role of time within the unconsciousness, or perhaps as the unconscious, and whether that might have shaped the idea of time as regenerative, how the unconscious pushes us beyond the linear and cyclical. I can say for sure, first of all, thank you for attending this talk. I'm really, really big fan of yours and big fan of your father. I just want to put that out there. Yes, Iqbal was definitely, there's definitely some Freudian ideas in Iqbal's thought. Iqbal actually cites Freud, he cites Bergson, he cites Einstein, he cites Whitehead, very deeply influenced by sort of the Europe of the early 20th century. And I have no doubt that it certainly shaped his idea of the unconscious, and the idea, his conception of time as regenerative, and so on. I would encourage you to look into his reconstruction of, if anyone's curious, I'd definitely look into his reconstruction of religious thought. I would also, there has yet to be, there are some published works about his poetry. I would say that a lot of his philosophy is found in his poetry, and I think this is what distinguishes Iqbal from many of his contemporaries, is that his philosophy is better articulated through his poetry, which is entirely in, about 60% of it is in Persian and about 40% of it is in Urdu. And there have been like translations here and there, but there's yet to be sort of an extensive commentary on the influences of Freud and Einstein and Bergson and Whitehead and so on and so forth, on his ideas. But I certainly believe that that influence certainly is there. Anyone have any other questions, comments? So the public-facing article, I've linked it in the chat. It was published for the LA Review of Books. You can take a look at that. I'm happy to share the paper with anyone on the condition that you just keep it between us. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments or criticisms.
I think if we don't have any more questions or comments coming in, this might be a good place to end things. And I'm sure Asad will welcome anyone reaching out to him with further thoughts after today's event. Asad, thank you so much for making the time to do this. This was really enlightening, and I really do hope that we'll be able to welcome you in person at some point of time in the future. Thank you again, Asad.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor to be here with you all.